Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to economics class, live from the woods. I just couldn't stand to be inside during the day. I normally record these at night, but I just couldn't make myself go inside during the day. So we're out here. Plus, it's a Saturday. I figure we're allowed to wear jeans on Friday, so I figured that rule would like extend just a little. Where if you're actually teaching on Saturday, you should be able to wear a Turnpike Troubadours T-shirt and a ball cap if you want. I don't know. Maybe I'm guessing. Especially when, let's just be honest, most of my audience right now, you're probably still in your sweatpants at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and have done nothing productive with your life, most likely. So that being the case, I think I'm okay. We'll see. We'll see if somebody yells at me for doing this. But anyway, this is the woods out back of my house. Hopefully we don't have any like unfortunate animal encounters captured on video. But anyway, this is the woods. Maybe you have time, I can show you. Somewhere out here, there's a tree that like a bicycle. I mean, it was here when I got it. But there's like a bicycle, like literally the tree like grew around it to where it's like this weird like half tree, half bicycle. It's a weird thing. It's a strange thing. Maybe we'll find it when the lesson's over. But for now, we'll pick up where we left off last time. Over last week's work. Hope y'all had a good first week back from spring break. Y'all should have finished up the section on business organizations and then looked at some stuff about labor. But we'll go ahead and review that for you just to make sure everybody got everything. So last video we were talking about a couple different types of ways that you can own a business. One of which would be a sole proprietorship where you own the whole thing yourself. Another of which would be partnership. And both of those have a few advantages. In that one, you control the thing itself. There's no fear of anyone taking it away from you or you losing control of the company you started. There's a certain flexibility that comes with being your own boss. But then there are the drawback, and two, you get to keep all the profit of the business. But then the drawbacks are you also get to keep all the debt of the business. So if your business goes belly up, you might have your house or your car or other valuable things leveraged against it, and you run a good chance of losing some of your own personal property. And partnerships may bear the, are a little easier to fundraise for because you have someone else, contributing to the pool of money. But then you also have to figure out like how to organize the thing and how to not kill each other if you're having differing opinions about like where you're going to go with the business. And then once again, even with the partnership, you can very potentially lose your own stuff as well because you and your partner will, in this case, be liable for any debts incurred if you go out of business. So today, we're going to look at the type of organization that was created as a way around that. The corporation. The corporation was really created around two key concepts. One, the ability to fundraise from a significant amount of sources, which is done through the selling of stock. And then secondarily, the fact that the corporation legally is treated as its own, it's literally treated by the law as a person with its own debts, which means that if you own a corporation and it goes out of business, your personal stuff is not touched. Only the things that belonged to the corporation in the corporation's name. Now, what could possibly be the drawback of that? Well, there's a few. So we'll look at them today. And corporations are important because they are not a very small percentage of businesses are corporations, but corporations also hire the largest percentage of people and do the highest percentage of GDP. So you've got a situation where on one hand, there's hundreds of, I should have put on some bug spray. I got mosquitoes and whatnot trying to get on me here. So, I mean, you've got like, you may have 100, small time, personally owned businesses, in a county. but they may only have a handful of employees. But a corporation is something like Walmart or Amazon or IBM or Microsoft or whatever. And in that case, there's only so many of them. There's only, a few hundred, there's maybe as many corporations in America as there are proprietorships in a given state. And yet they hire a tremendous percentage of the employees in the country. And and are therefore particularly important for the economy and have a lot of economic power in ways that sole proprietorships don't. The cost that you give up for trying to turn your business into a corporation, especially if it's a publicly traded one, is you wind up with a significant loss of control and loss of independence. So let's look at a couple things about the corporation. So the primary way that you become a part owner of a corporation is through the buying of stock. So you've heard people talk about buying stock. What does that mean? So a company decides to become a corporation, which means they go through a process of becoming legally incorporated, and then there can be two kinds. There can be a privately held corporation where you're not traded publicly on something like the New York Stock Exchange, and then there is a publicly traded corporation where you are publicly traded on things like the stock exchange, the NASDAQ, the S&P 500, what have you. So let's say, I don't know. I don't know how many shares of stock is available in a large company typically, but let's say that there are 1,000. The company's broken into 1,000 shares, and you buy 500 shares of the stock. Well, that means that you now have 50% control of the company. But of course, most of the time, very rarely do you have someone personally own that much of a corporation. For the most part, especially publicly traded corporations, there's thousands and thousands of shares. And so, if you happen to have PepsiCo in your portfolio, then you're a part owner of PepsiCo. Congratulations. However, here's the catch. Those profits are being divvied up among an awful lot of people. And so what happens is at the end of the year, when Pepsi tallies up their profits for the year, they divide the profit divided by the shareholders, and for each share of stock, it pays out what they call a dividend. So a dividend is the money that you make off of your share of the corporation's profit. So because you own, if you own 500 shares of stock in a company, then whatever the price is for the dividend for that year, you would get 500 of the dividend. And again, you can be privately held or publicly held. If you're publicly held, it's out there to be traded. And when you're publicly held, you have things that can happen like, an outside group deciding to pool forces and gobble up your company. And this is where a lot of the reputation of the heartless Wall Street trader kind of comes in, because they'll figure out, hey, we can actually take control of this company right now. And so, which is, it's just business, I guess, if you're doing that. But that's the danger you run as a, publicly traded company. So your book here uses an example of a hypothetical publishing business. They decided that they wanted to, so in this case, a couple by the name of Frank and Shirley here in this hypothetical have decided to turn their business into a corporation because they want to avoid unlimited liability. Meaning, if this fails, then we don't want to lose our own personal stuff. So anyway, so they become incorporated, and so that if F&S Publishing fails, only F&S Publishing has debts to pay, not Frank and Shirley themselves. So setting up the corporation is going to involve a lot more work and expense than if you did just a sole proprietorship. You'd have to get lawyers to draw it up and dot a lot of T's, cross a lot of... That's vice versa. Dot a lot of I's, cross a lot of T's, etc. And then you have to organize it like a corporation. So, which means that the stockholders, that is everyone that owns a share of the stock, is going to elect a board of directors. And the board is then going to hire corporate officers like the president, the vice president, the CEO, which means chief executive officer, the CFO, which is the chief financial officer. So the thing is, a corporation is really controlled by the board, and the board is elected. So the stockholders vote on a board, and the board votes on hiring someone to take jobs like CEO. And so those officers are responsible for operating it. The stockholders and the board of directors are not involved in the day-to-day running of the business. Typically, if you're just a stockholder, you basically just sit back and collect your checks, or and if it's not going well, you try to sell for the most part. Unless it comes time for electing board members, in which case it might, you might have more of a say in that or what have you. But and again, in addition to avoiding unlimited liability, you also have the advantage of everyone that buys a share of stock is bringing more money to the pool, which is why, right now, as so many companies are failing right now, a place like Amazon is not really concerned about that right now, because there's literally thousands of people that have, contributed money and pooled their resources so that they have this organization sitting there that can continue to run. And so corporations, in some ways, that's one of the big advantages of being a corporation. So a couple of things about them. The key methods of raising money are the sale of stock and the issuing of bonds. That's the other way that corporations make money. So a bond is a contract that the corporation issues that promises to repay borrowed money with interest on a fixed schedule. You may be familiar with bonds from the concept of government bonds, which I think we've discussed, if not in economics, then maybe last year in American history when we were talking about buying war bonds in World War II or something like that. So when you buy bonds, you're basically lending that company your money in the short run. If you bought a $100 bond, you're lending them $100 on the promise that later on you'll be repaid, say, $110. Whenever it comes time to pay you back. So corporations have limited liability, meaning only the corporation is responsible for the corporation's finances, not stockholders. If Pepsi goes into debt and you own stock in Pepsi, you know what? You're not going to lose your house over it. And then one thing about corporations, though, that's different is they have unlimited life, which means that if a proprietorship, if I were to go out and start Luke Fulcher's Lawn Service, God have mercy on us all. There's a reason I didn't do it in front of the yard, right? So if you started Luke Fulcher's Lawn Service, and then I died, so would Luke Fulcher's Lawn Service. And if, the two of us were to go into business and try to start it together as a partnership, if one of us died, the company would die with whoever died, because we would have to redo the papers and stuff and organize a new partnership, if we were to be replaced or whatever. A corporation, once you get it rolling, literally last until it runs out of money. So, now corporations do oftentimes have short lifespans. There's a little bit of a myth that the corporation never dies. If you look at, the Dow Jones, top 100 from 1955 and today, I mean, there's maybe 20 companies that still exist, and most of them have gone out of business. And in fact, the lifespan of corporations has gotten smaller over history. So a lot of companies were started in the 80s that were towards the top of the S&P 500 that are not near the top or even existing. So it's very possible for companies to go out of business. But as long as they can still operate, a corporation lives forever. If all the founders die, it keeps going. Ray Kroc is dead, McDonald's is still rolling. If Jeff Bezos were to kill over tomorrow, Amazon would still roll. Steve Jobs did die, Apple is still rolling. So why? Because a corporation literally has a legal life of its own that's outside and not connected to the personal finances or personal, continuing heartbeat of its founders. So, the advantage is if you start a corporation, you have access to resources. You can sell bonds, you can sell stock, lots of ways to get money. So you have a lot more access to funds, which makes it easier to expand quickly. Also, you can hire professional managers. You can put the money up, start the business, and let a CEO or whoever else run it for you. And if you as the founder want to stay involved in it, then you put yourself up for CEO. That's the problem. If it's a privately held, privately traded company, you can pretty much guarantee that you'll continue to have a senior leadership office. Well, when we get to the downsides, we'll see a publicly traded company. You could start the thing and then wind up out, which is one of the problems. But you got limited liability and you got unlimited life, which also means your shares. If you were to pass away, your shares could be inherited by your spouse or your children or whatever, and they would just, receive your stock and your percentage of the ownership. Now, the disadvantage is you've got a kind of a high startup cost because it takes a lot more legal work to get a legally functioning corporation rolling. A lot more paperwork. There's a lot of regulation. It brings you into the purview of organizations like the SEC or Securities and Exchange Commission, a whole bunch of other, Financial Consumer Protection Bureau. So there's a lot of red tape and regulation because, people in the government want to kind of keep tabs on certain practices that they may have deemed that at some point lawmakers deemed to be wrong. So for instance, something like insider trading, where if you have inside information about something bad's about to go down at the company, like legally you're not supposed to sell off all your stuff because you have an unfair advantage against the people you're selling to, right? So that's like a law. You can't take advantage of secret information that you may know in order to make a profit on the stock market legally. Well, this of course is a disadvantage compared to if you're a proprietor. If you see bad news coming, there's a lot less regulation on what you can do about it. You enter into the corporate world, there's a lot of federal regulation and state regulations as well, depending on what state you're incorporated in. A second issue is the issue of double taxation, because there's a tax on income and there's also a tax on capital gains, which is what you make from from the sale of resources. And then there's also the issue that a corporation pays a corporate tax before it pays out dividends. So let's use the example of proprietorship. Let's say I have started, I'll just keep using this example if I've started a lawn care service, right? Okay, so I look like a lawn care guy right now, right? So let's say I've started a lawn care service, and over the course of a week of mowing, I have made $400. Well, that $400 is going to be taxed as income, and one time, the same as if you were on salary working for somewhere else, at least if I understand things correctly. I'm not a financial expert, so take my word, but I think that's how it works. Pretty sure. Whereas when you enter into a corporation, you've got a different deal, because now, let's say that we had sold stock in a fleet. We started like Lawnco, Acme, whatever. And we sell stock. And now, let's say that we made, $5,000 because we got a fleet of 10 crews instead of $500. Okay. Well, now what's going to happen is the company is going to pay a corporate tax before those profits are distributed to the various owners of the stock as dividends. So then when you get your dividend, that money's already been taxed, but then when that dividend comes into your possession, you get taxed income tax on that, unless you reinvest it, in which case you get taxed at capital gains. But that's still, either way, you're going to get taxed twice. So that's one of the downsides. Income that comes as a consequence of stock has been taxed on two different occasions by the time it gets to you. And then, God forbid you die and your family inherit it, it'll get taxed a third time. And then finally, and this is a really important one, is that you run the possibility of losing control of your own company. Nowadays, people like to lionize Steve Jobs as like a hero of the corporate world because he came back to Apple and invented things like the iPhone and the iPod and so on that changed the direction of the company. But there was a period of time where Steve Jobs, who founded Apple, was fired from his own company that he started because they didn't like the way things were going. He had to, he went away for a while. He wound up being hired back, and then that's when it went from 0 to 60. I'll give you a real good example. So Colonel Sanders, who started Kentucky Fried Chicken. Okay, I look like I should be eating Kentucky Fried Chicken right now, right? So Colonel Sanders started Kentucky Fried Chicken. He eventually wound up, allowing it to become a corporation. He maintained a certain level of influence particularly on the taste of the food and so on. But the company was bought and sold on Wall Street, and I think nowadays it belongs to a company called Yum Brands that also owns Pizza Hut and a few other things. I know this because I watch the Kentucky Derby every year, and the Kentucky Derby is like, you can tell they go for the rich folk demographic on the commercials, because every other sporting event, like when you watch an NFL game, like they advertise Pizza Hut. When you watch the Kentucky Derby, they advertise Yum Brands stock. They don't advertise pizza. They advertise controlling a portion of the profit of Pizza Hut, right? So anyway, so KFC though, it's been passed around. At one point, one of whoever was the corporate overlord of KFC at a certain point in time fired Colonel Sanders, and Colonel Sanders didn't like this, and so he wanted to kind of compete with them, and he went and tried to start a chain called Colonel Sanders Chicken. Guess what? He found out he couldn't because he didn't own his own face anymore. Somehow, in all the way they had drawn up the corporation and everything, the likeness and name of Colonel Sanders became a property of Kentucky Fried Chicken, and therefore he was not allowed to even sell pictures of himself anymore because his face belonged to them, and they had decided that his time was done at the company, right? So he literally built the thing from nothing, created the 11 original herbs and spices, all this goodness, and now he literally doesn't even have the right to call himself Colonel Sanders in public. So that's one of the things that can go wrong. Real quick, while I'm on Colonel Sanders, I actually know a lady who used to go to church with him, and and he got born again in their church, and he'd been he was a pretty gruff guy before he knew the Lord, and he hadn't been saved very long, didn't know many of the rules, and so he was only been saved for a few weeks, and they got excited when Colonel Sanders got saved at our church. Let's bring him up to give his testimony, right? And the guy gets up and starts like dropping profanities in the pulpit, like he didn't know what not to say, and so he's talking about kicking Satan's this and that, and it was just it's crazy. He like dropped like 5 cuss words while he was giving his testimony. That was just for free. You don't need to remember that for the test or anything. So anyway, so corporations, you can lose control of your own company, and a lot of times what happens to corporations, corporate life is a little bit more mundane. They don't turn on a dime typically. Although, you've seen some companies have reacted a little bit quicker to like changes in the market over this past month than you might have expected, but a lot of times, to get corporate to approve something, an initiative or something, you have to convince a lot of people, and there's a lot that goes into it. And plus, just being part of a corporation, you're going to have all the regulations and human resources departments and different tiers of management that might clash, and so a corporation really does take on a life of its own, and sometimes it's harder to be quite as dynamic as it might be. But at one level, but on another level, it's easier because, if they want to do a big initiative, it's easier for them to get money because they can sell stock, sell bonds. Might get a little more leeway at the bank than your average Joe. So, again, pros and cons to everything when trying to determine what type of business that you want. All right, so And connected with the corporation is one thing that happens a lot with corporations is mergers and acquisitions. A lot of times one corporation will try to buy out another one or merge with another one so they can combine their assets. There's a couple different types of mergers. So one, you've got the horizontal merger, which is where two or more companies that produce the same or similar products combine. So maybe, I'll give you an example. So when satellite radio came out, there was really two satellite radio companies, Sirius and XM, and both of them realized that they had just about half the people that they needed to make it a profitable business. So they actually put their resources together and became one, Sirius XM, and now they're pretty much the only game in town for satellite radio. And at another point in time there might have been some antitrust concern there, but they weren't really going to run afoul of that because of the fact that satellite radio kind of came at a bad time for really taking off, because the people that would have been big fans of it not long after it came out wound up migrating to the digital download world, and Spotify and Pandora and all that stuff came out very soon. So either way, so they realized, hey, both of us have half of a successful business selling this product. If we can combine it, we could stay in business, and so that's what they did. A vertical merger is going to be a combining of companies involved in different steps of marketing a product. So a vertical merger is, okay, I own an oil refinery. Why not make myself rich in this example after making myself a lawn care specialist in the last one? I own an oil refining company, but I'm going to be dependent on someone else getting that oil from the refinery to the gas station, right? So if I were to go buy the trucking company that would go distribute that product, that would be an example of a vertical merger. A conglomerate is a business that's composed of several companies that each one produce unrelated goods and services. Sometimes companies can own companies that don't seem to connect with the original ownership just because they saw it as a growth opportunity. So for instance, NBC Television is owned by General Electric. General Electric was designed to make light bulbs and washing machines and stuff like that, but somewhere along the way they had enough money to buy out NBC TV, and they said, oh, well, why don't we do that? I mean, that's a great source of income. So a conglomerate is where companies of multiple industries have been combined into one common ownership. A multinational corporation is a large corporation with branches in several countries, and a lot of the biggest companies in the world are multinational organizations that some of their owners are in Hong Kong, and some of them are in Berlin, and some of them are in London, and some of them are in San Francisco, and they're just all over the world. Let's see. And of course, I mean, there's a little bit of skepticism. Multinationals kind of have a little bit of a mixed reputation. Because there's some good things and bad things that come with the multinational corporation. I mean, one thing is you've got easy access to a lot of customers in lots of different parts of the world. On the other hand, as we've seen, I feel like I'm doing too many China rants in this video. I feel like one day a Chinese communist is going to try to kill me over this or something. You've got all these companies. We learned with the whole NBA incident with Daryl Morey, the Rockets general manager, making some disparaging comments about the Communist Party and what they were doing in Hong Kong, which had been, a free region. And then all of a sudden the NBA is out of all this money because things are so dependent on this international business, this phenomenon known as globalization, where you've got you're really relying on foreign markets. And you've had some moments, like for instance with this whole coronavirus deal, finding out, how many of our drugs are made over in China, and they're not really necessarily always in the mood to share or be helpful when now that the pressure's really applied. So on the other hand, let's just be honest, despite what everyone wants to say come election time, the bottom line is free trade and being able to trade across national borders has been absolutely a net positive for the economy of the world. You know, it's been responsible for you know, we really decreased the amount of people in what they call extreme poverty, which the UN definition of that is like $1 a day, if I'm not mistaken. Which, I mean, granted, that's a low bar for extremely poor, right? But nonetheless, extreme poverty decreased, you know, like literally was cut in half in a decade. And this is largely the result of, you know, the presence of international business, and multinational corporations make international business easier to do. I don't know if this is still the case. I'm not up on the current stats, but there was one point in time where the #1 manufacturer of cars in America was actually Toyota, and the #1 manufacturer of cars in Japan was actually Ford. And so, you know, people who want to do this whole always buy American thing, you know, well, check. Maybe, you know, there's a Volkswagen plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee. There's Toyota plants all over Alabama and some of the various southern states, and they're able to sell cars more affordably because they don't pay the same prices that these, you know, union-run shops in Detroit do. So so for the most part, you know, free and international trade has made people wealthy all over the world, but we're also seeing in the middle of a moment like this where, you know, borders are at least temporarily closed, and you have you find out how many of these companies are really beholden to foreign governments that aren't necessarily our friends. So you wind up saying, okay, there might be some downsides to this as well. You know, there's the myth that, you know, that this kind of foreign trade really decimated, you know, manufacturing jobs, and, oh, they sent all the jobs overseas to Mexico and China. That's really not true. Really, for the most part, the jobs were replaced by robots, not Mexicans. I mean, that's a lot of people. It's harder to run a political campaign on the premise that you'll never get those jobs back because you've been replaced by a computer than it is to say, oh, look, they sent all the jobs overseas. So people run with that. But statistically speaking, you know, the whole world as a whole, and even the United States specifically, is much wealthier for having had free and international trade. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's entirely a good thing, though, to have these foreign, to have, you know, the potential for foreign governments, and almost every Chinese business is part owned by the government. That's kind of the part of the way they run their, you know, pseudo-capitalist, semi-communist thing that they do. So you've got this this other factor, though, we're kind of seeing like, yeah, maybe having all of our goods tied up in companies beholden to stockholders in, you know, communist countries is not a good idea. So it's kind of a complicated discussion. But anyway, so that's a little bit about corporations and multinationals, and I'll see you back with another video in just a moment here.